Welcome back, everybody. This afternoon session. We're going to start with a tribute to Mark Sherwood from Michael. Michael, do you want to go first?
Should we cut them?
This presentation is not about me, it's about Marika Sherwood. Right, those are the hands up, who knows Marika? Everybody. A good half. Marika is a doyen of black British history. She's in her late 80s now and finds it really difficult to travel. So she's not here, but she has a paper. I'm going to read a brief reaction to an introduction to the paper. Just to give you a feel for those who don't know Marika. She's written many books, 19 books on black British history, and in terms of Pan-Africanism, education, countless articles on the same subject. She's traveled widely in Europe and Africa, speaking about Britain and black people, particularly Pan-Africanism, well known for that. And I was just small, but the fact that I quite liked it. She's written almost 10 articles on the Oxford National Biography. You know, she's a really committed person to black British history. And the way I got to know was through BASA, the British Association, the British Asian
Black and Asian Studies
Association. And it was through that there are, I don't know if you've ever seen it's finished now, the article, the Action magazine, but it's really DIY magazine because I've got a very limited budget. But the things that we're talking about today, she was writing about, in the 80s and earlier. She was writing articles in BASA. And on a personal note, BASA Marika introduced me to Miranda in terms of we got together through our common interest in the black Jews and let's say the rest of history. So what I'm going to read to you now is Marika's words, not mine. I must apologise for only being as I'm unable to attend. I'm aging fast, so not well enough to travel to Bangor. I would certainly love to be there, especially as the article I've just finished is about a man of Somali origins who lived in Barry and from very early in the last century to his death in Cardiff in 1950. The article is The Life and Times of Abi Farah, MBE, and I hope will be published in Llafur, through my pronunciation. Next slide, please. There's the man himself. Some months ago, searching in one of the many books for info about some black activists, I saw Abi Farah, Barry, awarded the MBE by King George IV, George VI rather, for his wartime services to Seamen. I didn't recognise his name at all, but I'd done some research in Cardiff, so I went through the many books on my shelves on the history of the black population in Britain. No mention of Abi Farah. I thought the best place to start my research would be to find the recommendations for the MBE. So I contacted the relevant government departments. They could not find anything, except after much questioning, they actually confirmed the award. I began by searching the National Archives and found only 2 files. One is a brief letter dated 18th of November 1948 from the Treasury Chambers regarding the recommendation for appointment of an MBE. But this recommendation was not enclosed. The other is an application for a Mrs. Farah for a passport, including this title, for a letter from the government official in Somalia. The report to the Cardiff police showed him to be a man of bad character. And a letter from the passport office later states that it is forwarding police reports made in 1923 and 1921. But these reports were not included. So here's another black activist the government does not want us to know about. So I just had to find Mr. Farah. I asked, what must be hundreds of archives, libraries and organisations, historians for information, all tried to help, but did not find much. I learned that he arrived in Cardiff sometime before 1910, when he married Hilda Anderson. He is listed on the marriage certificate as a boarding house keeper. And this is what he did for the rest of his life. Run many boarding houses, probably exclusively for Somalis, and permitting them to stay even when they could not pay. Unemployment rates for Somalis, unemployment rates for discharged seamen were horrific during World War I. I have not been able to discover how or with whom he opened a number of clubs or what their work was, both in Cardiff and Barry. And the clubs were the Cardiff and the Barry Colour Society, the Colonial Club in 1943, a hostel in Barry was opened, the Domino Youth Club in Barry in 1947. Abi Farah also worked for and helped raise funds for a mosque. I have found 3 newspaper reports of the police taking him to court for some sort of infringement of the rules regarding Siemens boarding houses. But I think that Mr. Farah was under police surveillance for just about the whole of his life in Barry and Wales. And all reports should be released. There should also be a very thorough search of all local newspapers. I have searched very, very little with the help of some Welshmen. After about half my article sets the context for Abi Farah's life and activism, looking at local historians and the local histories and the riots of 1919, police attitudes, the treatment of coloured seamen by the government legislation and trade unions. After all, this is what he was dealing with. I also report on national and possible local black organisations. I presume that Farah might have worked with all. The last of what I can discover about Farah's family and his works include the article concludes with the 1940 MBE awarded to Abi Farah, and then in 1956 the OBE to his son Abdul-Rahman Abi Farah, and in 2012 for Stephen Kirrier, the son of Abi Farah's second wife, who married Elmi Carrier, also from Somalia, after Abi died. I want to end by emphasising how little information appears to have been presented in Wales, and quite obviously the government is withholding all the reports and it had received about this very active, challenging black men. We need to petition the government, including the police, to release all the files on these black men and women and their organisations. Thank you.
Can I just say very quickly, we've got a lot of information on Abi and his family.
Okay, but you make contact with that's fine, I'll get her email to her. She loves some shit with you.
Thank you, Michael, for that tribute. Thank you very much. I think this session this afternoon ties in perfectly with the session that we had this morning and what Charlotte mentioned about transnational connections and interconnections. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our 4 speakers here this afternoon. First of which is Cai Fôn Davies, originally from Tyrone in Anglesey. Cai is an alumnus of Bangor University, having graduated with first-class honours in Welsh and history last year. Cai has been a keen competitor in Eisteddfodau from an early age, has appeared on numerous stages throughout Wales and beyond, and has won several national and international competitions over the years. And today he's going to talk about a victory for freedom, John Griffith, the correspondent African-Americans in the 1866 Civil Rights Bill. Our second speaker today is Norbert Mbu-Mputu, recording here. Norbert is a journalist, writer, filmmaker, and researcher in anthropology and sociology. He's a former UN worker and former team leader in Africa of an international NGO. He has studied in the UK, in Belgium, and in the Congo, and has published many books, including his most recent Llafur, an updated French language account of independence leader and first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Patrice Lumumba. Norbert has also developed an expertise in common histories between Congo and Britain and coordinated the project Bound in Mambo, The Witnesses, Congo and Wales Roots and Roots. Our third speaker, Professor Robert Burroughs, Black Support for the Congo African Training Institute on a similar theme in Colwyn Bay. Robert is a cultural historian and literary critic who specialises in areas of empire, humanitarianism, slavery and race. He has published several monographs on subjects including the Royal Navy's suppression of the Atlantic slave trade and African testimony in the movement for Congo reform, and his latest forthcoming book is entitled Black Students in Imperial Britain, coming out this year. And our final speaker, Joseph Radcliffe, is a second-year PhD student at Birkbeck, University of London. His research explores in detail the role of the Siemens boarding house in the migration and settlement of seamen from the Caribbean and West Africa in Cardiff, Liverpool and London. So if I could ask Cai to come to the front of the stage. This talk is in Welsh, so we have simultaneous translation for you all with headphones. And without further ado, if everything's okay.
Has everybody got
Has
it?
everyone
And can someone give us a dummy slide on what we do?
Yeah. I'll either be providing the text from the back page, have Alex in translation.
Has anyone got a spare headphones? Is that one behind you now, on the piano?
You should have this small speaker, and you just need to switch it on, and then you should be hearing my dulcet tones coming over. Okay, so the headphones go like so.
I'm sorry, there's somebody speaking English?
Welsh would be resumed. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Well, over to Cai.
Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr. Pnawn da i chi gyd, good afternoon to you all. As James said, can I just say before I start, before you put your headphones on, how much of a pleasure and an honour it is to present here today. As James said, I am a graduate of Bangor University, and this is actually the first time that I've been in a lecture hall of any kind since I graduated, which is a strange feeling, does bring back memories, but no, it's great to be here. And I'd like to just give you a vague idea of what I'm presenting today. This is a very fascinating, compelling chapter and story. You can see John Griffith, he was the most famous Welsh journalist of his time in Wales, and his journey to the USA during the early years of Reconstruction, where he got so many things, and amongst those things was the passing of the 1866 Civil Rights Bill. So I shall now switch to Welsh. You can go put your headphones on if you haven't already. Yeah. Ar y 10 o Fehefin 1865, chwiliodd un o agerlongau Inman SS City of London I mewn I borthladd Efrog Newydd ar ôl taith sormus o gwta pythefnos o Lerpwl. Ymhlith y canodd o deithwyr a ddeunodd oddi ar ei bwrdd y diwrnod hwnnw, yr oedd un gŵr bychan o Gymro, gŵr eiddiw a thennau o ran maint a digon bregus hefyd o ran I iechyd, ond gŵr a oedd o ran I enwogrwydd a'i dylanwad yng Nghymru 4eg ganrif ar 15 yn gawr. Nid mewnfudwr oedd hwn chwaith, ei fod yn ta'n gwireddu breuddwyd wrth lanio yn yr Unol Daleithiau. Y gŵr hwnnw oedd John Griffith, neu y gohebydd a defnyddio enw yr adweinwyr ar lawr gwlad. Newidiadurwr enwocaf a physicaf Cymru ei oes. Dyna chi borthladd Efrog Newydd mae debyg yn yr oes. Ac am y 2 blynedd nesaf o 1865 hyd at 1867, byddai John Griffith yn crwydro ledled yr Unol Daleithiau gan ysgrifennu adroddiadau lliwgar a threiddgar am ei brofiadau yno. Nad oes gen I amser yn anffodus hynny yma I fanylu ar fywyd a gyrfa'r gohebydd, rhaid pwysleisio cyn cychwyn I arfycad ym myd y wasg ac yn wleidyddiaeth Cymru 4eg ganrif ar 15. Ganed y gohebydd mewn tŷ ffarm o'r enw Bod Gwilyn ger y Bermo yng nghanolbarth Cymru yn 1821. Fel grwsedd dechreuodd y gohebydd I yrfa, ac ar ôl cadw siopa yn Lerpwl ac yn Llangynog, Symudodd John Griffith i fyw i Lundain yn 1847, lle dechreuodd y trefennu erthyglaen archlysurol i gylchgrawn y Chronicle a lygwyd gan ewythr Samuel Roberts Llanbryn Mair, un o radicaliaid mwyaf Cymru bedwaredd ganrif ar 15. Yna yn 1857, dechreuodd John Griffith gyfrannu llythyrau wythnosol i Banner ac Amserau Cymru. Newyddiadur newydd a sefydlwyd gan gawr arall yng Nghymru bedwaredd ganrif ar 15, Thomas G. Yn 1861, byddai John Griffith yn cael ei benodi yn ohebydd Llundain i'r Banner, penodiad a fyddai'n golygu mai fyddai'r gohebydd Cymraeg proffesiynol cyntaf. A'i waith yn y swydd yma yn gohebu a fyddai'n sicrhau ei le yn hanes Cymru. Byddai erthyglaen wythnosol i'r Banner yn cael dylanwad grymus ar Gymru bedwaredd ganrif ar 15. Yn wir, ystyrid mai ei golofnau oedd y modd mwyaf effeithiol y deuau gwleidyddiaeth Prydain a datblygiadau yn San Steffan yn adnabyddus a dealladwy i bobl cyffredin Cymru ac enwedig i Gymru Cymraeg uniaeth. Yn rhinwedd ei swydd fel gohebydd Llundain, mae'n naturiol felly mai i'r Banner a byddai gohebydd yn ysgrifennu mwyafrif o'i ysgrifau yn ystod ei ymweliad yn yr Unol Daleithiau. Y tro cyntaf i newyddiadurwr Cymraeg proffesiynol weithredu fel gohebydd tramor fel mae'n digwydd. Ond byddai'r gohebydd hefyd yn cysnodi ychydig iawn o'i amser prin a daith yn America mwyn ysgrifennu erthyglau ar gyfer cylchgrawn arall, cylchgrawn yr annibynnwyr Cymreig y cenhadwr Americanaidd. Yn y llythyrau hynny, byddai'r gohebydd yn rhoi sylw mawr i'r Americanwyr Africanaidd ac yn ymroi llawer iawn o'i egni a nifer iawn o'i erthyglau mwyn gohebu ar y frwydr gynhennus honno a fu i sicrhau hawliau sifil iddynt. Nid oes dwywaith i John Griffith lanio yn America ar adeg nodedig o gyffroes yn hanes y wlad honno. Adeg mae'n debyg na fu odydd i chyffelib yn hanes yr Unol Daleithiau fel y dywedodd y gohebydd ei hun. Cyrhaeddodd Griffith yr Unol Daleithiau bron i ddeufis yn union ar ôl chyfrifiaeth yr arglwydd Abraham Lincoln, digwyddiad a ddath ddyddiad unig ar ôl i Lee ildio i grant yn Appomattox a diwadd y rhyfel cartra. Rhyfel a rhwygodd yr Unol Daleithiau'n ddwy gyda thaleithiau caeth, y de wrth gwrs yn brwydo yn erbyn rhai rhydd y gogledd, gan ladd 700,000 o bobl, cymaint ar nifer o Americanwyr gael ei lladd ym mhob un rhyfel yn hanes y wlad hyd heddiw wedi rhoi at ei gilydd. Un arall o ganlyniadau rhyfel oedd diddymu caethwasiaeth yn yr Unol Daleithiau, gan neu 4 miliwn o'r caethweision duon oedd yn byw yn y de, wrth gwrs, yn bobl rydd. I ganol y berw gwleidyddol a chymdeithasol hwn, y glaniodd John Griffith yn America, gyda'r bwriad gwreiddiol o gynrychioli Cymru mewn cynhadledd ar gyfer eglwysi annibynnol yr Unol Daleithiau yn Boston, cyn symud mlaen i dalu ymweliad a sefydliadau y Cymru yn America, gan gynnwys y wladfa Gymreig a lwyddiannus honno a sefydlwyd gan ei ewythr Samuel Roberts yn Nryd Ffynnon yn Tennessee. Ond diau, mae ysgogiad mwyaf i ddodeithio i'r Unol Daleithiau oedd ei awydd i fod yng nghanol crisis na fu ei fath yn holl hanes America. Ymrafal oedd yn ymwneud â hawliau Americanwyr Africanaidd a'i statws yn y America newydd honno ac rewyd yn sgil y rhyfel cartra. Wrth iddo gerdded ar hyd yr harbwr yn Efrog Newydd, ddylswch chi lun ohono fo gyna, yma'n byd debyg y bydda John Griffith wedi gweld rhai o'r bobl ddion hynny. Ac fel rhywun a oedd yn ôl dylanio'r a diddordeb byw yn achos y bobl ddion ac yn y frwydr dros gryfyd iddynt, diau y byddai hefyd wedi bod yn ymwybodol iawn o'r symudiadau cyfreithiol oedd yn gwneud ei ffordd trwy'r Gyngres i roi hawliau cydradd iddynt. Erbyn i'r gohebydd gyrraedd yn Unol Daleithiau, yr oedd y Llywodraeth Federal yn Washington wrthi'n ailosod ei hawdurdod dros y wlad. Ac yn ceisio gorffen y gwaith yr oedd gweinyddiaeth yr arlywydd Lincoln, diweddar arlywydd Lincoln, wedi dechrau arno cyn ei lofruddiaeth. I Lincoln fyw i weld y Gyngres yn cymeradwyo'r trydydd gwelliant ar ddeg, gwelliant cyfansoddiadol a fyddai'n cyflawni prif amcan y Proclamation Rhyddfreinio, Emancipation Proclamation, ac yn rhoi gwaharddiad parhaol ar gwaith wasiaeth yn yr Unol Daleithiau. Nid oedd y gwelliant hwnnw'n yn drin na hawliau'r cyn-gaethweision yn y de, na chwaith yn amlinellu statws dan y gyfraith, neu statws newydd dan y gyfraith. Fel y sylwodd John Griffith ei hun, yr oedd safle a statws cyfreithiol yr Americanwr Africanaidd yn un anenwig iawn. Bellach dyma y negro yn ŵr rhydd, ond gŵr rhydd ar lawr y diwrto, heb gartra, yn dlawd a diamffin, fel pererin yn y tir, heb hawliau o unrhyw mater, gwladol, dinesig, na chymdeithasol. Tu allan i gylch amddiffyniad cyfraith y wlad yma'n byw ynddi, a'r wlad y cawsau yn eri ynddi, a'r wlad y bu yn cario'r clef i'w hamddiffyn. Nad aeth yr arlywydd Lincoln erioed gyn belled a phobl fel Robert Everett, coeddwr y cenhadwr Americanaidd, a radicaliad arall hynny a credau y dylai pobl ddion gael eu hystyried y gydradd ac Americanwyr gwyn yng ngolwg y gyfraith. Y mae lle i gredu fod Lincoln adag ei farwolaeth wedi dechrau symud tuag at gefnogi'r safbwynt hwnnw. Cam i'r cyfeiriad hwnnw yw'r dystiolaeth drawiadol honno sy'n dangos i Lincoln fod wedi dechrau cefnogi'r barn y dylai o leiaf rai o'r bobl ddion ac cyn-gaethweision gael y bleidlais. Yn ei araith gyhoeddus olaf ar yr 11 o Ebrill 1865, awgrymodd Lincoln y byddai o blaid estyn y bleidlais i rai o'r Americanwyr Africanaidd, ac yn enwedig i'r bobl ddion hynny a wnaeth ymladd dros yr undeb yn ystod y rhyfel cartra. Meddai Lincoln, it is unsatisfactory to some that the elective franchise is not given to the coloured man. I would myself prefer that its were conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve as our cause as soldiers. Na chawn fyth wybod yr hyn y bydda Lincoln wedi wneud ynghylch hawliau'r bobl ddion, ymgorfforwyd yr egwyddorion hynny a dechreuodd i gefnogi gan ddwy ddeddf cysylltiedig a gyflwynwyd ger bron y Gyngres yn 1866. Y ddeddf hawliau sifil, a'i brawd llai enwog a phwysig chwedl y gohebydd, deddf biwro'r ceithion a rhyddhawyd. Dwyn y cyn-gaethweision hynny yn ogystal â'r bobl ddion hynny o eisoes yn rhydd, yn ffurfiol o fewn fframiaeth cyfreithiol o wlad oedd diben y ddeddf hawliau sifil. Deddf a warantau i'r Americanwyr Africanaidd, ddinasyddiaeth Americanaidd lawn, yn ogystal a chydiodoldeb ger bron y gyfraith. Pwrpas yr ail ddeddf oedd awdurdodi'r biwro'r ceithion a rhyddhawyd, asiantaeth lywodraethol a sefydlwyd gan weinyddiaeth Lincoln mwyn cynnig cymorth ymarferol i'r cyn-gaethweision yn y de. Byddai John Griffith yn glanio yn yr Unol Daleithiau fel yr argwynebyd pan oedd y frwydr dros y ddwy ddeddf yma'n cyrraedd i panterth. Rhywbeth a alliogodd iddo droi at yr hyn a wyddai ac awnau orau ei briod faes chwedl dylanio'r bod yn ohebydd seneddol. Ac ar mai un o'i nodweddion amlyca fel gohebydd a fel newyddiadurwr oedd ei awydd i fynd i lefydd drosto'i hun ac i weld a'i lygad ei hun, byddai John Griffith yn gwneud yn siŵr o fynd i'r Capitol yn Washington mwyn gwylio dadleuon hanesyddol hynny yn ymwneud â hawliau'r Americanwyr Africanaidd. O blith y profiadau a gafodd y gohebydd yn ystod ymweliad yr Unol Daleithiau, uchafbwynt y daith honno yn ddiar oedd iddo fod yn dyst i'r dadleuon hynny a fu ynghylch deddf biwro'r ceithion a rhyddhawyd a'r ddeddf hawliau sifil yn y Capitol. Trwy gyfrwng y disgrifiadau manwl a thrawiadol a dynodd o'r dacla brwd a thambaid a welodd ar lawr y Gyngres ynghylch y ddwy ddeddf yma, gallai tanysgrifwyr y cenadwr Americanaidd ddarllen am y dwysau a fu yn y frwydr wleidyddol ynghylch hawliau'r bobl ddion o bersbectif Cymraeg. Brwydr oedd hon rhwng yr arlywyd Andrew Johnson ar un ochr, a oedd yn hyd y gohebydd a sawl un arall, yn rhy drigarog wrth y taleithau cydffederal a'i harweinwyr, ac yn malio dim am hawliau'r bobl ddion. Ar yr ochr arall i'r ddadl, yr oedd y gweriniaethwyr radicalaidd, a arweinwyd gan gwleidyddion megis Paddy Siemens a Charles Sumner, oedd yn mynnu y dyla'r cyn-gaethweision a phobl ddion American cyffredinol gael eu hystyried yn gydradd a'i cydwadwyr gwyn, a'i fod yn deilwng o ddinasyddiaeth Americanaidd lawn, yn ogystal â hawliau sylfaenol eraill megis yr hawl i bwydleisio. Bu i Johnson fwrw i gefnogaeth tu ôl i'r farn, y dylai bobl ddion gael ei dwyn yn ffurfiol o fewn y gymraeth. Daeth Johnson yn gyndyn iawn i gefnogi'r symudiadau hynny i roi hawliau sifil i'r pobl ddion unwaith gafodd ei benodi yn arlywydd. Yn wir, cymaint oedd i wrthwynebiad i weithredoedd a gyngres fel y defnyddiodd Johnson i fito arlywyddol yn erbyn deddf gwirio'r gweithio ar ei hawyd yn Chwefror 1866. Gan ddadla, mae mater i'r taleithiau a nid i'r Llywodraeth Federal o deddfu hawliau sifil i'r bobl ddion. Gosododd Johnson fito ychwanegol yn erbyn y ddeddf hawliau sifil ym Mawrth 1866. Dychwelodd y ddwy ddeddf ger bron y gyngres, ac yno'n dys i'r golygfeydd pan baswyd y ddeddf hawliau sifil gan y Senedd, a hynny dros fito'r arlywydd am y tro cyntaf erioed yn hanes America mewn debyg oedd y gohebydd. Mewn ysgrif a ymddangosodd yn rhifin Gorffennaf 1866 o'r Cenadwr Americanaidd, disgrifiodd John Griffith yr hyn a welodd ar y foment dyngedfennol honno. Ar ôl 3 diwrnod o ddadla brwd, carwyd y Civil Rights Bill gan y mwyafrif angenrheidiol o 2 o'r Senedd. Nid anghofiwn pe cafew i oedd mesw lea, yr olygfa yn y tŷ, ar y llaw, yn y galleries a'r lobbies. Dyma o lawer y climax pan y cyhoeddodd y llywydd oedd y mesur wedi gario over the veto. Bym yn Llygadys o rai sîns lle gyfroes gyda ni yn Senedd Prydain a Brydiau. Pryd oedd ei bywyd y weinyddiaeth yn crogi ar y bleidlais. Ond nid wyf yn cofio'r funud hon am unrhyw amgylchiad ac y gwelais y fath outburst o deimlad yn torri allan ar draws pob reol ac oedd yn Senedd yr Unol Daleithiau yn Washington. Nid oedd bywyd y weinyddiaeth yn troi ar y bleidlais hon, ond yr oedd iamderau gwladol a chrefyddol 2,000,000 o bobl yn dibynnu arni. Wel, dwi'n siŵr sa'ch chi'n cytuno, yma'r ysgrif hon yn hynod drawiadol a hynny am sawl rheswm. Yma'r darlun teimladwy a gyfleir yma'n un a fyddai wedi gafal yn war unrhyw un a fyddai wedi darllen. Boed ar dudalen arfanner yng Nghymru neu ymhlith cynnwys y Cenadwr Americanaidd yn yr Unol Daleithiau. Hyd yn oed i rywun yma yn yr 19th ganrif ar 20, gellir ymdeimlo ar gorfoledd a gyfleir yma gan y gohebydd, a'r hyn a welodd o o'r dathliadau yn y Capitol yn Washington a hefyd ar y strydoedd ar y diwrnod hanesyddol hwnnw. Ond ymhlith yn ysgrifiad uchod y gohebydd o'r Americanwyr Africanaidd yma un pwynt gwirioneddol bwysig, cydraddoldeb yn anghosiadol y gohebydd. Fel y megaf Bill Jones, byddai John Griffith yn rhoi sylw mawr i'r Americanwyr Africanaidd yn y gohebyddau hynny a ysgrifennwyd ganddo ar ei daith yn yr Unol Daleithiau. Gyda'r bobl ddion y mynnau siarad y hwyl, iddynt swy y byddai'n gofyn am ei barn a'i geiriau hwyl dyfynnau yn ei erthyglau. Ac y mae modd cadarnhaol y mae gohebydd yn disgrifio'r bobl ddion yn ei ysgrifen awgrymu'n cryf i mi beth bynnag, ei fod yntau wedi ystyried pobl ddion i fod yn gyfartal a phobl winion, yn wahanol iawn wrth gwrs i fwyafrif pobl winion America a Chymru ar y pryd. Nad sylwebydd niwtral a gorau i feddwl oedd y gohebydd yn ei ohebiadau am yr Americanwyr Africanaidd, ni ellir amau i John Griffith yn ei agwedd gadarnhaol tuag atynt fod yn argyhoeddedig yn ei gefnogaeth i'r bobl ddion, ac iddo fod yn bleidlo i'w hachos yn y frwydr honno i sicrhau hawliau sifil iddynt. A thrwy gyfrwng erthygla y gohebydd, cawsai darllenwyr y Cenadwr a'r Faner yn ôl yng Nghymru, gyfle i rannu ei brofiadau, ei argraffiadau a'i bortreadau diffyant a themladwy o'r bobl ddion. Nid oes dwywaith i'w ymweliad ar Unol Daleithiau ar amser y treuliodd yn gohebu ar yr Americanwyr Africanaidd, gael dylanwad grymus ar y gohebydd. Fel y dengys Bill Jones a dylaniorwaith, byddai taith John Griffith i'r Unol Daleithiau yn cael effaith ddofn ar ei weithgarwch wedi iddo dychwelyd Gymru, ac yn arbennig felly ar ei ymdrechion nodedig yn ystod etholiad cyffredinol 1868 a'r erledigaeth a'i dilynodd. Na fyddai'r gohebydd yn darganfod ei radicaliaeth yn yr Unol Daleithiau, yn wir, yr oedd y radical ymhell cyn hynny. Gellir heiri i'r angerdd a'r egni a fyddai'n nodweddiadol o'i ymdrechion yn ystod etholiad 1868, deillio o'r hyder, y sicrwydd a'r gobaith a ysbrydolwyd ynddo gan y tro ar y byd yr oedd wedi credu oedd ar waith yn America. Yn wir, yn y colonnau hynny yr anfonedd at y Canadwr Americanaidd, gwelir ymdeimlad o obaith ei fod wedi gweld yn y wlad honno wawr yn codi ar y bobl ddeon. Gwawr oedd yn addo cydraddoldeb, rhyddid a chyfiawnder. A phan daeth hi'n mater o ddisgrifio dyheuad y Cymru i gael pleidleisio nôl i hewyllus ei hunain, a hynny'n rhydd o unrhyw bygythiad y gallant gael ei troi mas o'i cartrefi gan ei landlordiau toriaeth. Defnyddio'r profiadau hynny a gafodd yn America wnaeth y gohebydd, gan gymharu ei hysba hwy am ryddid ac achos y bobl ddion yn y frwydr honno am laddwyd chydig blynyddoedd ynghynt am ei hawliau sifil yn America. Ac yn gydnaws ar modd y gwnaeth Llywodraeth yr Unol Daleithiau ddios cadwyni'r cefnisiwn ymaith a rhoi hawliau sifil iddynt, gan dymchwel goruchafiaeth othrymus y ceffreistri dros y pobl leol. Felly hefyd, yr awgryma'r gohebydd y dawr dydd yn cael Cymru hwythau i rhyddhau o grafannau gormesol i tir meddianwyr. Yng ngeiriau'r gohebydd. Dyna'r dathliadau gyda'r llawn. 2 blynedd union i'r dyddiau hyn, yr oedd nhw'n aros ar ddysg y planhigfeydd Cotwm yn Alabama ac yn troi ymysg yr hen Ceffreistri. A dyma'r gwyn a glywyd yn barhaus ganddynt, fyddai rhegi'r radicals o'r north oherwydd ei bod o blaen estyn i civil rights yn egroed, yn gosod class against class. Yr un gwyn yn berffaith ac i'r llythyren sydd yn ein hebyn unau y dyddiau hyn, gan ein cynrychiolwyr anrhydeddus a rhyddfrydig o Fôn a Flint a Cheredigion. Ond diolch i'r nefoedd, fe gafwyd terfyn ar rwys gath ei nasiad Legris, Kentucky ac Alabama, ac mor wired â hynny daw terfyn rhyw ddiwrnod ar wisgfawredd ffroen uchel Legris, Ceredigion. Llathen o'r un brethyn yng ngolwg y gohebydd oedd y meistri Cotwm Americanaidd a'r meistri tir Cymreig. Legris, y barn y gohebydd oeddynt oll. Cyfeiriad wrth gwrs at Simon Beckley, y Cai Ffreistr creulon o gampwaith Harry Peter Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Ac yn debyg iawn i'r modd yr oedd Cai Ffreistri creulon y de, bellach yn anheilwng o'i lle yn y byd modern. Yr oedd y landlordiaid a'r perchnogion tir yn Nghymru hwythau'n anghymwys o gael cynrychioli pobl Cymru. Ac yn union fel y daeth cwymp y cotton planting aristocracy, fel ei gelwyd gan y gohebydd, yn sgil rhyfel cartra. Felly hefyd y byddai'r tir beirianwyr Cymreig ryw ddydd yn colli ei grym. A thrwy gyplysu dyheuad werin yn Nghymru am ryddid ac achos y bobl ddion am hawliau sifil yn America, nid oes dwywaith y byddai erthyglau John Griffith, y gohebydd, wedi cael argraff ddon ar Gymru yn yr hen wlad a hefyd yn America. Ar ôl 2 flynedd yn teithio drwy gydol America, mynd yn ôl i Gymru, wnaeth y gohebydd, lle byddai'n treulio'r rhan fwyaf o oes yn ymgyrchu dros nifer o achosion nodedig, hyd nes i farwolaeth ar y 30 o Ragfyr 1877. Yr un blwyddyn ac y daeth yr ail gorffori Reconstruction i ben fel mae'n digwydd. Er yna wyddom beth fyddai agweddau'r gohebydd tuag at y broses honno ar ôl iddo dychwelyd i Gymru. Nid oes amheuaeth i'r profiadau a gafodd yn America yn ystod y cyfnod hwnnw gael effaith ddon arno ac ar gweddill ei yrfa. Fel y mynyga Bill Jones ymhellach, by'r daith honno i America yn dropbwynt y mywyd a gyrfa'r gohebydd. Fel y dywed Bill Jones, nid rhywbeth ymylol i fywyd oedd ymweliad y gohebydd ac America, ond digwyddiad o bwys mawr. Ac os credu'r honiad yr hanesydd Matthew Crago i golonnau y John Griffith, deffro Cymru wleidyddol, nid gormodiaeth chwaith byddai honni i daith y gohebydd i'r Unol Daleithiau fod yn digwyddiad o bwys yn hanes Cymru hefyd. Yr hyn y gellir ei honi'n bendant ych hynny, i fi John Griffith yn ei ohebiadau ar yr Americanwyr Africanaidd yn ystod blynyddoedd cynharaf yr ail gorffori, fod yn ymgyrchydd ymroddedig dros yr Americanwyr croenddu, ac iddo fod yn bleidiwr brwd dros ei hawliau. Ac wedi ymweld a mynwent bron bach Llangollen, y man yn claddwyd John Griffith yn diweddar. Peth rhyfeddol i'w meddwl, mae yno ar ôl yr holl filltiroedd y teithiodd drwy gydol ei fywyd, a gorffennodd taith bywyd un o gefnogwyr mwyaf y bobl dduon yng Nghymru. Gŵr a fi heb os, yn dal achos y bobl dduon, a'i brwydr dros ryddid a chydraddoldeb yn agos at ei gael. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you, Cai. That was excellent. Sure we'll all agree. Thank you very much. Next up, we have Norbert.
It's not easy to speak after a very interesting talking, and especially speaking up some point of what really I will continue. And I will continue also of what you said. Can you imagine this important person? You phone even the government record, they don't have anything. And coming back to what Professor Williams said before, so we have really a job. And this job, inspired by Mariam, put this long title, Feed the Vacuum. So we need to feed the vacuum of history, but we need also to bridge the gap. I live in Newport for 10 years, and one of the famous bridges in Newport is the footbridge. We need really to footbridge the gap of the narrative, and also we need to do it beyond the English speakers' Black British history. And so that will be really what I want to share with you. How really we need to feed the vacuum, to bridge the gap of the new narrative, and how really we need to take the advantage we have now to go beyond the usual English speakers, Black British history. I need to say first thank you to Marianne because she really inspired me. And every time when she's doing something, she tries to invite really to say to me, you need to do something. And thank you also to Professor Charlotte, because when I got trained, well, she was in October 2004, and my friend Frédéric Yamusang, which is a writer, Congolese writer living in London, phoned me in the morning, said to me, look, you live now in Welsh. Look, when I was studying Kent University 5 years ago, I bought a newspaper, and they wrote about the Congo boys. And I was reading a book, I found these things, so can you find what it's about? And he phoned me, it was about 2 in the morning, my friend. So in the morning I went in the library, and then I found the book, Welsh, the Tolerant Nation. And I was surprising to read what the professor wrote there. I think I photocopied this page, I don't know how many times. So Professor, thank you very much. It was really a kind of seed, as you wrote in your book. And so that is really how I came across all those stories. But let me going back to my Africa culture and the mother tongue. In my mother tongue, which is Gisakata, there is a proverb that says, that means when you decide to buy the drums, you must also try to buy the drummers. Because if you just buy the drums and you don't have the drummers, that means your drum will go in the bin. And another proverb that says, I will say it in Kisakata and then translate really in English. If in your will you decide that you will be buried in that place, that means you have people who need to carry your coffin. If not, your coffin will be stored somewhere. So this is really the role and the job of the storyteller, the role of the historian. The history is there, people are there, like this famous person, but if you don't have the drummers, if you don't have people who can carry the body, no, you will not be buried in a good place. So, I'm not really an historian. I came in history by chance, as I said. It was because I found some vacuum, and then I started doing research to feed and to feed those vacuum. And that came really because I got a chance to live in Welsh. To be honest, after living in London for 1 year, after living in Belgium and France, but the first day when we came to Welsh, and this my big fight in Welsh is to remove to our mentality to say, oh, we are just a small country. No, we are not a small country. I remember, and I still look for this guy from immigration who brought us to Welsh. He said to us when he was crossing the Severn Bridge, the now Prince of Wales Bridge, he said, look, guys, we are crossing the border between England and Wales. You are very, very lucky. You will live in a very, very nice country, welcome country. But check, in the other side, you have the old Severn Bridge. We are crossing the new Severn Bridge. And the most important, when we arrive in the other side, Welsh is the only country in the UK where people use two languages. But you will see something I will show you. So when we cross the bridge on the left side, he said, look there, Koso Gambo. Welcome to Welsh. He said, look, how those people are so fantastic. And of course, since I came to Welsh, I met really fantastic people. Not only people like you, but people who was living with us. So the inspiration of what I was doing came really from ordinary people who were living with us in Newport. I will mention, for example, I started questioning about our history inspired by a guy, Roy Markfield, who is still living in Newport. 10 years ago, we got these things 2 years ago about the Windrush generation. But 10 years ago, Roy Markfield started recording stories of those people. And because I was good in designing, I worked with him to design 20 booklets of the Windrush generation. Can you imagine? And that inspired myself also to question about our history. And also Professor Seamen of Swansea University, he inspired me how to design my own books. He said, look, Norbert, you can't wait just to have a publisher. You can't do it yourself. And I work with him. So all my life, and this is my problem, when people they ask me, where are you from? First I say, oh, I'm from Welsh. Oh, where are you originally from? Oh, I'm from Congo. But because it wasn't Welsh really that I became an adult person. Another point, we are living now in a post-COVID period. And what happened during the COVID period? We lost most of our old people. And we couldn't bury them. We couldn't mourn them. And most of them, they went with their stories. So, there is a job we need to do now to feed this vacuum, to use whatever we can use to record, because they call me. I remember one of the older person who was every time with me in Newport, Isaac, he died. I couldn't come to bury him because because of the COVID. So this is what really we need to do now. And why really I took this long title? Recently, I was traveling to France. I like to travel to use the the covoiturage, because the number of people you meet there are fantastic. I met with a young Russian lady who is studying in one of the fantastic universities in London. And because everything now is about Ukraine war, we suddenly, even the far right in France, they understood they need to open the border to refugees and to asylum seekers, luckily. But this lady, she's studying politics, science. She was surprising why really African people are not backing Ukraine, why they support Putin, why. And for someone who is studying politics, science, so I need to explain her, look, do you know that Putin, for example, fought with the African independentists in Africa? So how do you want those people you was supposed to say is a bad guy? No. So I need to bring some stories. And I remember, and I share with her, most of you will remember the first interview of Nelson Mandela in America, when they questioned him to say, why really we support you support Fidel Castro Gaddafi? And he said, sorry, your friend, you think that your friend need to be our enemy? Or no, we got also our interest. So it's important. That means our part of his story is not known. So we have a job to do. And what we are doing now in Welsh to start this curriculum of Black history is very, very important. We are the first country in the world to start really with the Black history. And where I'm from, the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, there are some people who made a positive impact in our history, but they are not known from the Congo. If you tell the Congolese guy about Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, I never read this book. The first time I saw this book, I'm a scholar guy. If you explain about Roger Kesman, who is an Irish independentist who was the first British guy who investigates against King Leopold II atrocity, it's not known in Congolese history. I'm working now in a project about Edmond Morel. Edmond Morel is not even mentioned in the Congolese history. So, can you imagine those kind of positive person? They are not mentioned in our history. So we still have a job to do to bridge those gaps. So why we need to fill this vacuum? I say we are living now in a very, very fantastic but challenging period since we got our young people of Black Lives Matter. But there is something, a challenge somewhere. The challenge for most of the time when I go to those young people is to avoid to think that all the white person, the European people, the Western people who were connected to the Black history were bad people. So we need really to bring everything in a balance, to check this story. And the best way to do it is important also to check our narrative. You know, we fought with this historian Demby about Henry Morton Stanley, because the establishment and the scholar, they portray him as a bad person. And as Congolese, we were surprising. So when we brought our narrative, no, I remember fighting almost with the people who was running the a project in Demby. I explained to them, I said, you need to listen to us. So what we need to do, is possible for us to sit down so that we listen to your version and our version will check where there's something wrong somewhere. But they say, no, we don't want to listen to you. So we only need to listen to their version. So this is the mistake. So And most of you will remember, for example, what President Sarkozy said when he was president. He was in Czech and Tajok University. I will come back about Czech and Tajok. Czech and Tajok is the first African scholar who wrote about the ancient Egypt, who explained, who brought the evidence, all the Pharaohs, they were black people. And in that university, in Dakar, President Sarkozy said, look, the problem with you black people is that because you have no history, you have nothing. Can you imagine? So this is the president of France. So it means, and he's a very, very educated person, like the lady I met, but they only want us to swallow their part of history. This is why it's important for us to bridge. And why really, there is the lady mentioned about Professor Oliveto Telly, as a friend, we live in Newport. Her part of the history of the slave trade history is very, very interesting, because when we live in the West, we only learn about the slave trade history from the lions or from the hunters. And Dr. Otele is bringing the part of the slave trade history from the African side. Because in Africa, we learn that our brothers were kidnapped. Here, we are learning that no, African people, they sold their own brothers. So, it's important for us to go back so that we will bring those stories. And our chance, we have now a new chance. The new chance is the diaspora. I got the chance to meet with one of the famous guys I met in my life, President Barack Obama. And what he keeps saying, and his first book is The Dream of My Father. So our fathers got dreams, and we are the ones who need to fulfill those dreams. So, and that's why really every time I say thank you to Dr. Maya, because she's bridging those gaps. Because we are there, can you bring your part of the story so that we put it together to check in which direction we need really to move together as we are doing it today. And there is something I wanted to mention. There is a Professor Achille Bembe of Cameroon. He's explaining something he's calling the post-colony. But I say, I wanted to give him an email, and he never come back to me. I say, no, Professor, it's not the post-colony. It's the neo-colony. The neo-colony, for me, is this space where really we need to fight to make listening our version. Because we thought that with the independence, and I will come back to the independence, we thought that with the independence, we are really independent. But with this Ukraine war, we realized, because we are not independent, because there's a big joke. So we still have a work to do, to fight, to be hard, and to bring our part in this history. And how to do it? We need really to do it beyond our colonial borders and language. That if you are in Britain, you will learn only about people who are connected to the Anglophone side of Black history. If you ask, even to a scholar guy, do you know about Sheikh Anta Diop? You never read about Sheikh Anta Diop. If you go in France, I was in France a couple of months ago, for the first time that they got a big exhibition in Paris about Ubuntu. Because from the Francophone side, Ubuntu is the concept from the Anglophone side. If you go to Portuguese, they got also that. So, where are we going? So why and what is it? What is the big question mark? If you go back to the history of the Pan-Africanism, for example, a century ago, or the negritude. They were the black people from America who inspire others in London. They start and they involve those who were studying in France. They even went back in Africa to collect those who were in Africa, as we saw with the project in Colwyn Bay with the remarkable Reverend Hughes, who created the Congo African Institute of Welsh. Can you imagine, a century ago, a guy in Welsh decided to have 100 students, young people from Africa, and those countries didn't exist by that time. But now, with all the facilities we have now, we are giving an impression that we are moving back in our corners. You know, if you are with the Nigerian, they will just explain you about the Biafra war. If you tell them about the Congolese war, what is the Congo? Like that since 20 years. When you are in the Congo, they don't know about the war because we related it to our colonial borders. And a couple of years ago, you know, if you wanted to fall from Kinshasa to Nairobi, you need to fall to Paris to London. Can you imagine? Even the plane. Those days they try to improve, but to travel from Kinshasa to Nigeria, you need to take an aeroplane from Kinshasa to Paris, London, you come back. Those days they try to improve those kind of things. So those names, I will come back to my book, Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, the Mani Congo, Edmond Morel, Mbu-Mputu. Mbu-Mputu is the guy who, if you go to UNESCO building in Paris, Mbu-Mputu said, because he was a storyteller, he said in Africa, when an older person is died, that means there is a library buried. So it's important for us to listen to them. But we know about Mbu-Mputu from the British side and the British diaspora. So this is a job we need to do. About Cheikh Anta Diop, I mentioned about Cheikh Anta Diop. It's the first scholar who fought really with all the scholars around the world, just to make them, to show to them that the ancient Egyptian who created the modern civilization we are now living with, you know, all the scientists we know, they were black people. And they brought the evidence with the carbon 14 tested, whatever. But it's not known from this side. I like something every time when I go to Liverpool in a slavery museum. And this is puzzle in slavery, the Black Achiever Hall. You can see all of them. And most of the time, we forgot about the women who fought. And they are the kings, you know, who resist against the colonization. There are many. We just learned about how the slave trade happened. But in my tribe, in my mother tongue, for example, there's plenty of stories of people who fought against and who even killed those slave traders and the colonizers. And that is going, this is a positive for us about Henry Morton Stanley. Every time I say to people, if Henry Morton Stanley was a bad person, they will kill him in the forest. Going back in Africa, the only explorer who went back in Africa 5 times, they will kill him. And he was traveling in area, no one have any information about where he will finish. How could he be stupid to start killing people? Yeah. So, that is really what we need to do. So, how we need to do it? We need our black history. We need to unlock our black history. We need to be an international history. You know, people like Nelson Mandela, like Barack Obama, and so on. Our kings, our queens, they need to become part of the world history. And we need to do what I call the decolonization of our narrative. The stupidity in the colonization, when Africa 1960 became independent, in 1963, when they made the organization of African, they decided that we will not change the colonization borders. And by that time there was two groups. The group of Casablanca, who want us to be independent in small country, and the group of Monrovia, who wanted to create the African Union. No, it was the Casablanca who won. But can you imagine, it was just after the European Union, they create the European Union, that African also, they say, oh, we need now to create the African Union. A little bit late. So, we need to really to bridge Anglophone, Francophone, Lusophone, be inspired by the Pan-Africanism, the negritude, and the black history romanticism is still something, the jargon from the British side. We need to bring it in. There is someone who is doing an interesting job in Bordeaux to start copy also the black history romanticism. I will enter by those names, I mentioned about those names. My own contribution, since I came to Welsh, this is my last book. It's about Lumumba. The book is still in French. I decided next month I will send the copy to Bangor, to Welsh archive, because this book belongs to Welsh. I wrote it during my years in Welsh. But what is interesting in this book? I try to tell about all those stories. For example, do you know about Amo Affair? Amo Affair is a scholar African of the 17th century, the Enlightenment, who was a professor, the first black professor in German university. We're in the 17th century, he's from Ghana. It's not known. You know the lady, we know the story in the Bible of Masada, how the Jewish people fought against the Romans. But we got this same story when the Arab, because most of the time we just speak about the Western slave trade, we forgot about the Arab slave trade. Those ladies from Senegal, they fought against the Arab trade. The first human rights declaration was not in Africa. So, all those stories, I will end there. It's important. We have young people. Our young people, they use now the digital. So we need really to bridge, to map, and then to bring everything to them. So that is really my point. How really we can.
Following on from Norbert, has done a lot of work on the Congo African Institute. I'd like to welcome Robert Burroughs.
Thanks so much to the organisers. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to speak to you today. I'm going to talk about my forthcoming book, which has this title. It's coming out in November, I think, and it should be open access, so you can read it online, which is a really nice thing. Quite important when we were talking about accessibility to Black history earlier. I think it's an important point. I start that book by talking a bit about the problems of my own positioning in this history of the African Institute, which is what we're really going to talk about today. And the question of why I get to write this book, why me as a white, English, academic, so in many ways a sort of beneficiary of the education structures that we've been talking about today. And I will be happy to talk to any of you about those kind of serious questions, but spoiler alert, though, I don't have any easy answers to those questions either. But I think that you want me to probably launch into this, talking about this, so I'll put that to one side, at least for the duration of my paper, which will be about the African Institute. Between 1889 and 1911, the small, rising holiday resort of Colwyn Bay, not too far from here, played host to this really unusual experiment in imperialism and charity and race relations. The Congo Institute, which later becomes rebranded as the African Institute, was the invention of Reverend William Hughes, who's on that picture. He was a Baptist missionary who had served in Central Africa in the early years of its colonisation by the Europeans. Hughes' time as a missionary was really marked by the death of his colleagues, his own long bouts of sickness, and his attempts to keep hold of a small fledgling community of African boys who he felt were open to Christian instruction. Now, ill health forced Hughes in the end to abandon his mission career, but he took two boys, also in this picture, Kinkasa and Nkanza. He took them with him from Africa. And once returned to his homeland in Wales with these boys, Hughes struck upon an idea to import young Africans for a kind of practical education and a religious training in what he regarded as the morally and medically sort of healthier climes of his own native lands. The idea was that by preparing students both as preachers and as sort of artisans, really, he could expect them to return to Africa as missionaries who could work without financial support from Britain's mission bodies. So he's making this argument, there's an efficiency to what I'm doing. I'll train up the Africans and then you won't have to keep funding them to evangelise Africa. By 1890, Hughes had founded a school in a large Victorian building, which he renamed Congo House, and he formed a Congo Training Institute Committee to oversee his work and to help him attract support from subscribers. The Congo House itself was entirely dependent upon the generosity of subscriptions. In 1891, he secured patronage of the Welsh American explorer, Henry Morton Stanley, whom Norbert has just been talking about, and also King Leopold of Belgium. The two, I think, main figures in the European partition of Africa. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. Between 1888 and 1891, Kinkasa and Nkanza were followed to North Wales by 9 more students from either from Congo or from the Cameroons. Their schoolwork then became more routine, and many of the male students were entered into apprenticeships with local tradespersons. They would also find themselves often performing on stage in lectures and in sermons, as well as other forms of entertainment. They raised money for the Institute as what Celia Qureshi might describe as colonised peoples on parade in 19th century Britain. Some of the youths from this period emerged as sort of star pupils. They became at least locally quite well known, and they were keenly supported by the local community during their preparation for their return to Africa. I've just put one example of many from the local newspapers of the kind of advertisements that would feature for the talks and other presentations that Hughes would give in raising money for his school. One of the things that interests me about that, there's an advertisement, and it's just, the advertisement columns of a newspaper, is how prominent the name Nkanza is within it. Black boy from Africa, and I don't know if that means that he got some sort of personal repute, but at least the opportunity to see young Africans on the stage was clearly an attractive element of Hughes's lectures that he gave. Unquestionably, the boys, when performing on the stage, were being framed in that sort of discourse of the Dark Continent and of the redemption of Africa, which Leopold Stanley and countless others were using at that time to justify the violence of colonialism. Now, the supply of students from Congo ends in about 1894. The Congo state authorities very ominously banned migration out of the colony by young Congolese. Hughes had seen that coming, and the year before he'd established a bunch of sort of recruitment depots, I suppose, in the German-occupied Cameroons, in the Republic of Liberia, and in the British coast, Niger Coast Protectorate. And then in other parts of British West Africa, in Sierra Leone and Lagos and the Gold Coast, which is Ghana, of course, various African supporters start to take interest in Hughes' scheme, and they form associations that provide financial support and publicity and help to select new trainees. By the time we get to the 1900s, the catchment of Congo House expands further and further, so that you've got young students arriving from Southern Africa, from the USA, and also from the Caribbean, just in small numbers. In total, 87 students, including 3 girls and young women, attend Congo House, according to the lists which are published by Hughes. However, that overall number is very debatable, because Hughes seems to have overlooked certain individuals who were there, certainly as students, and he also seems to have nominated some people whose status as student is not actually that definite. And that confusion is significant, because the school collapses in 1911 amid a sort of racist sting operation in the British press concerning the fathering of a child with a local woman by one man who'd been registered as a student. And in the subsequent libel trial, it emerged that under severe financial pressure over several years, Hughes had falsified accounts, he'd misled donors on details of student registrations, he'd even borrowed a request of one of the young female students. So that trial ruined Hughes, who died in very diminished circumstances in 1924. Now, writers at the time, back in the 19th and early 20th century, whether they were European missionaries or whether they were Pan-African intellectuals, they frequently attempted to understand the students and their experiences in Britain in very sort of crude and lumping terms about their racial or African identities. And of course they were brought together by that shared racial heritage, but the student body at Colwyn Bay was actually really quite diverse in terms of social and cultural background, in terms of age, in terms of place of origin. So in my research, it's been really important to try to sort of pull apart, disaggregate their experience. They were themselves a relatively privileged subsector of Black Victorian Britain, but still the students reveal something about the variety of Black experience at the heart of the British Empire. And in retelling their history, I think we need to heed Stuart Hall's point. Stuart Hall's been quoted already once today. He's always there, isn't he? We need to heed his words that, and I'm quoting now, cultural identity is not so much about a return to roots, R-O-O-T-S, than about coming to terms with our roots, R-O-U-T-E-S. So I focus on their journeys to, their experiences in, and their lives beyond the school. Reveals quite radically different experiences among the students, owing to the specifics of context. So that's what my book does, really, and there are loads of really fascinating ways of looking at these students. One of the things that I could have talked about today, which I think would have been hopefully interesting to you, is, for instance, how some of them will come to dabble in student politics and get involved in very early anti-racist and pan-Africanist organisations in Britain, which are questioning the rising colour bar in the colonies at that time. But in this paper, I want to just talk a bit more about one really important factor in understanding the differences between these students, which I think has been a bit neglected in some of the earlier discussions of Congo House. And that's the shift away from the sort of Congo-based recruitment of students under the acts of European missionaries, and toward African-sponsored, African-initiated recruitment of the students from West Africa. In its early guises, the Congo Institute appealed to a majority-white Victorian set of patrons, and it did that by offering up an image of darkest Africa, in quotation marks, to be rescued through civilizing goodwill. And that kind of imagery remained in place. It never goes away. But as the school changes in the mid to late 1890s and comes increasingly under the influence of Africans and African intellectuals, then it also starts to accommodate ideas about Ethiopianism.
championing of a sort of Afrocentric Christianity. Ideas which were shared among independent church leaders in Western and Southern Africa. And as Africans and Pan-African intellectuals start to back the school, then the age and the educational backgrounds of the students selected to travel to North Wales, that also changes a bit. The school, its very purpose, starts to shift subtly. The students get older, basically, the age tends to go up, and it becomes something of a finishing school in the end for young men seeking entry to British universities, with the intentions of going on to pursue careers in law, in education and in medicine, so not necessarily to return to Africa as missionaries at all. Now, it might be tempting to imagine that the school's income comes from an ethnocentrically sort of uniform Victorian evangelical population. And of course the large majority of income does come from white Victorian patrons. But to understand that too simply would be to perpetuate a Victorian era myth that would clearly separate out British donors and African recipients of charity. And that myth has legacies in our own time when you think about celebrity-based charities such as Red Nose Day, for instance. The reality, one that I think can help us to rethink those modern-day prejudices, is that black people were themselves routinely involved as agents in 19th century humanitarian culture. And that's true for the Congo/African Institute. Not only were the students engaged in promotional work for their school and other charitable causes, they even contribute financially to the scheme. So to give you a couple of examples of that, in 1890, one of the Congo-born students named Daniel Harvey, the taller figure in the picture on the left there, he volunteered £1.10 of his own wages to the school. He was a child at that time, in our own sort of working out what constitutes a child. It's about £125 in today's money he gave away. Students would continue to give money even after they had disappeared and gone back home. And that would help them to extend their relationship to the Institute beyond the time of their enrolment. So, to give you another example from Ambas Bay in Cameroons, the return student, Joseph Burney, would send 2 and 6 to William Hughes 1 year. He was a high-achieving student who had been generously supported by the Colwyn Bay community prior to his departure. He did return as a long and successful missionary in his homelands. And it wasn't just students who gave to this cause. Pan-African advocates of the scheme, such as the African-American preacher and former slave Thomas Lewis Johnson, who's on this slide, and his own Jamaican protege, the intellectual and missionary Theophilus E.S. Scholes. They also gave their time and their money and helped to establish black networks of giving in Britain and in Africa. And in that network, the efforts of Reverend Isaac McPherson, who's in the middle of that slide, warrant some extra attention. He had no direct relationship with the school, as far as I'm aware, but he was exceptionally active in raising funds on its behalf. McPherson's connection to the school was apparently made through Johnson and Scholes there. He had preached in Scotland with these men in the mid-1880s. In the 1890s, McPherson would collect money on behalf of the Institute from the people of Newport. He twice won the prize for fundraising that the school would offer each year. And the prize was for his picture to be printed in the Institute's annual report, so that's how come we have a picture of him today. The face of this, in the words of the time, his coloured brother, joined those of other black students and gentlemen now populating the Institute's publications. Now, in its most successful years, financial input from African subcommittees, the groups organised in Africa to raise interest in the school, they played a sporadic but an important part in maintaining the school. They would channel enthusiastic backing from leading figures in Sierra Leone, Lagos and the Gold Coast.
And in each of these colonies, institute subcommittees were formed out of that sort of wider middle-class grouping to would define and debate their role in the political and cultural and economic spheres of British colonialism. They raised money and they helped select students to go on to Colwyn Bay. So quite a few notable figures were involved while being resident in Africa in the operations of Congo House. To give just two examples, the Lagosian preacher, intellectual, Majula Egbebi, who you can see there among the students wearing the robes. He was a linchpin in Africa for William Hughes and his school. And I found also that the Gold Coast Committee was presided over by Joseph Ephraim Casey Hayford, a quite famous lawyer and author who wrote what is now regarded as possibly the first black person's novel published in Britain, Ethiopia Unbound. So things are stirring and Pan-African intellectuals start to become interested and involved in the school. Now, to be clear about it, even as the Institute's horizons start to broaden, the students remain routinely typecast in generic and racialised roles. Indeed, I think that as the student body becomes more diverse and better informed about global race relations, more valued as agents in drumming support, then newly offensive and typecasting demands are sometimes made of them. So public entertainments laid on by the school in the late 1890s include, for instance, students having to sing popular minstrel music, much of it highly offensive by today's standards. The school ran I'm using quotation marks again, an African Curiosities exhibition each summer for tourists in Colwyn Bay, and it would contain a sort of hodgepodge of exotic items attracted to, basically, intended to attract tourist pounds. But the involvement of black supporters and the students themselves in producing these performances and these exhibitions starts to complicate any over-easy assumptions we might make about who possesses agency in these charitable exchanges. The Pan-Africanist, Egbebi, who I just pointed to on that slide, he, for instance, did more than anyone to establish the profile of the Institute in West Africa, and he also arranged for new African curiosities to be displayed and sold in Colwyn Bay. And more interesting than that, he also ensured that the proceeds from the sales of those items went on to support Dr. Bernardo's orphanage. So that's a striking example of African agency supporting not only African causes, but also sort of domestic British ones. It's a bit of a reminder that this community of like minds did not always conceive of that charitable relationship between Africa and Britain in simple or unilinear ways. Now, as Africans and other black supporters become involved, the character of the public appeal made by this school changes slightly. To a greater extent than it had before, the school, in its latter phases, helped Britons to think in somewhat more progressive terms about Africans as partners in evangelical and humanitarian projects, not just as simple recipients of charity. I want to end my paper, if time allows, for a few more minutes, to give one quite detailed case study in which I want to demonstrate that point. It involves the two men who are on the slide here, one of them pictured twice. So here's a bit of detail for you. In March 1910, two of the students, a Sierra Leonean named Ishmael Pratt and a Nigerian, Hidia Ladapo Oluwole, travelled to Stockport as representatives of the Congo House. Pratt had already obtained his medical qualifications from Edinburgh, and Oluwole was close to the completion of the same award at Liverpool. Pratt would then go on to take diplomas, incidentally, at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine and at the University of Dublin, the latter, interestingly, in midwifery. Hughes would refer to Oluwole as the most brilliant of all the students, who while at Liverpool had come within 10 marks of receiving the gold medal of the university top guys, basically. He graduated in 1911 as a Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery, and there's interesting newspaper reports from then of hundreds of people filling the sort of town centre in Liverpool and cheering him on as he goes up to receive his degree. In Stockport, on behalf of Congo House, the two young men visited a Sunday school, reputedly the largest in the world, taking part in a concert to raise money for it, alongside a couple of music groups, one called the Albion Male Voice Quartet, and another called Walker, Wrigley and Stockton. They performed alongside a pianist and also a humorist, a comedian. The local press described Pratt, and I quote, as a fully qualified medical man and an excellent vocalist. And Oluwole was rather understatedly said to have great resources in recital. Now, turnout for the concert was a bit disappointing, but the students stayed on overnight and they returned the next day. Then they spoke to 300 attendees of the school's second class, and they made complimentary remarks on the new Centenary Hall, which had just been built. Then they performed at a larger gathering at the Edgeley Men's meeting. Pratt sang 2 solos, while his more junior counterpart, Oluwole, gave a talk about the need for African missionaries in the missionary movement. Oluwole then returned to Liverpool, but Pratt stayed on for the evening entertainment at Edgeley, and again, his compliments, this time to the comedian, made the press. The following morning, Pratt was shown to the town hall and shown around a hatmaker's factory, both experiences being greatly appreciated, according to the press. So there's a bit of detail there, but I wanted to talk about what I think that little story means. I think what these brief lines of newspaper reportage really show us, or hint at least, is that there's a quite complex negotiation of feelings about charity and gratitude going on here, more so than is evident in some of the earlier reportage about the young Congo children's performances. Value is being attributed to Pratt's compliments, and here's in Oluwole's appreciation of their hospitable treatment. There's a sort of sense of equitability here in the account to some extent. In the early performances by the Congo children, the donors have been encouraged to feel sort of pity, sympathy, and so extend that in the form of generosity to those students. But in the later performances like this one, there's a sense of sort of reciprocal exchange of thanks. The entertainers are also briefly the entertained. The recognition of their status as participants in a mutually gratifying encounter is again apparent in another press report from the same encounter in Stockport, which notes that Oluwole expressed warm thanks for the welcome that he'd received and said that men of colour did not always receive such a reception. He confessed that it made him nervous to address such a great audience, and humorously remarked that he could not speak to them. He could speak to them with greater facility if he used his own language. So it's not only in his remarks about racism there, but also in his admission of his nerves, and his jokes about language, that Oluwole was permitted to confirm to those audiences what charitable encounters like this were intended to really claim, which was that they're all part of a programme of civilizational uplift together. So in those kind of meetings, the crowds were backing the students, not merely as objects of charitable pity, but also, and I think more so, as fellow agents of evangelical humanitarianism in Britain and in Africa. And that would be a nice sort of cheering place to end my paper, but if I've got one more minute, then I will just sort of note there is a sort of postscript here, which is that it doesn't end there, of course. The school does close down a year later, and things do turn much grimmer, not just for this school, but really, I think, generally for communities of black people in Britain in the 1910s. That decade culminates, of course, with the race rights protests. But at the start of the 1910s, there's certainly a sort of withdrawing, a withering of charitable sentiment for black people. You can start to see it coming. And one of the ways it comes out is in the press campaign which emerges against the African Institute. it's known today because there's sort of been this sort of sexual scandal, a romantic scandal, but if you look at the original press coverage, then one of the things that's also really important is people start to doubt the value of the missionary movement itself. They start to really question that. You can even see it in the sub-header, that this report would expose the futility of the mission. So very quickly, and almost at the same time, there's that progressive sense of Africans and Britons coming together. There's also that pulling away, which will ultimately lead to the end of the school. So that's a depressing ending note. But there's some positives that they might presented too. I will leave it there. Thanks so much.
We're now moving on to our final talk for this session. If I can ask the questions to come to forward, please.
I've got to get some. I might go there.
First, I'd just like to say, to echo all the other speakers, it's a real privilege to be able to be here and present this work. So this paper forms part of my wider doctoral research that explores the role the Siemens boarding house played in the ecology of the port cities of London, Liverpool and Cardiff, and how most importantly it affected early Caribbean and West African migration and settlement in late Imperial Britain from 1891 to 1939. The Siemens boarding house was a contact zone, a cross-cultural colonial melting pot of interaction and encounter, unique within the heart of the imperial metropole, where typically these zones existed on its fringes. The boarding house went beyond a simple lodging for black seamen. It acted as both a social and compatriot network, a hub for organised activity, and a support system for seamen who found themselves unemployed or struggling to secure regular work. And this paper will focus on Cardiff and explores how the Siemens boarding house sat at the centre of a burgeoning black community supporting its growth and development. While the city's docklands, Bute Town, was a diverse, multi-ethnic space typical of maritime quarters across Britain, its Caribbean and West African population settled in a small concentrated area surrounding Loudon Square. The Siemens boarding house not only played a crucial role in anchoring and supporting this settlement, but by using it as a prism, the historian can gain a clearer picture of settlement growth and community formation over time, and expand our understanding of the social lives of early Black Britons. Historians in the field have long acknowledged the importance of the Siemens boarding house to the livelihood and support of colonial seamen of colour in the metropole. However, no in-depth study of the boarding house and this relationship or its role currently exists within the historiography, and this research looks to address this gap in the literature. While Cardiff, conversely, has been subject of important work exploring the city's early multi-ethnic communities and their complex relationship to both the state and the labour market, as well as their experiences of racism and discrimination. And this field is indebted to the work of Professor Neil Evans, whose research underpins much of the modern scholarship, supported by Marika Sherwood, who we saw earlier, and more broadly, Professor Laura Tadili. And the ghost of anthropologist Kenneth Little tends to loom large over any work conducted on Cardiff's early black community. And while pioneering for the time, aspects of his work have come into criticism for reflecting outdated attitudes. However, due to more recent scholarship, the modern historian has a broader range of sources, limiting reliance on Little's work. It would also be remiss not to acknowledge the work of local citizen historians in the field, whose intimate knowledge of South Wales and Cardiff and its diverse history supports any academic work. And this research also benefited from the recently released 1921 Census that opens a hitherto closed window that allows for a deeper exploration of post-war black settlements and communities, and this is the entry for 36 to 37 Maria Street, which was a boarding house run by Uriah Erskine for Caribbean seamen. The Seamen's boarding house was an integral part of the economic and social life of port cities throughout the 19th and early 20th century, and central to the seamen's time on land. Commonly occupying the grander houses, formerly built to house merchants and their families, industrialisation saw these wealthier occupants move out of the dock area and their homes repurposed for the port economy. Llafur Square and its surrounding streets, built for Cardiff's merchant classes, provided ideal properties for the boarding house. The Seamen's boarding house not only sustained and supported the transient seamen whilst on land between voyages, but it was also a vital conduit through which they gained access to the labour market. The boarding house keeper often acted as an unofficial employment broker, a service for which they took a healthy commission. And the dynamics between the keeper and seaman were complex, characterised by a relationship of power and dependence, as well as benevolence. Now, available data suggests that the occupation of Seamen's boarding house keeper was predominantly a migrant profession. Large numbers of boarding house keepers migrated to Britain from other parts of the world, while a significant internal migration from within Britain is also evident. For example, in the 1891 census, not a single Seamen's boarding house keeper had been born in Cardiff, though 4 had migrated from other parts of South Wales. The diverse demographics within the profession reflected the cosmopolitan character of the seamen that they lodged, as well as the wider melting pot of sailor town. And while predominantly a male occupation, running a boarding house was one of the few professions that offered employment opportunities to women in the male-dominated port environment, and a significant number of women worked in the profession, both assisting their husbands and as independent entrepreneurs. Now, often established along national, cultural and ethnic lines, the Seamen's boarding house provided a safe and familiar space for seamen in a foreign land. While, at the same time, as Brad Bevan highlights, this arrangement also allowed boarding house keepers to leverage their kinsmen for profit. Cardiff had Seamen's boarding houses that catered to Yemeni, Scandinavian, Somali, Maltese, Greek, Spanish, Japanese, Chilean, Italian and Chinese seamen, among many others, in addition to those from the Caribbean and West Africa. Their keepers were often ex-seamen, who chose to open boarding houses when they settled in Cardiff. Who better to understand the need of sailors than an ex-seafarer? Opening a seaman's boarding house was an important method that allowed a seaman to transition from a transient to a settled migrant. And it also afforded a certain amount of social mobility within the constraint of the port economy as the working class seaman transitioned to business owner. Contemporary and modern sources have long recognised Llafur Square as the centre of the historic black community in Butetown. In 1933, Nancy Sharp conducted a report on behalf of the Methodist Society. Her report produced these maps, highlighting the distribution of black family homes. This report was part of a wider trend of social surveys conducted in the 1930s by both public and private organisations, commissioned as part of a growing moral panic in reaction to Britain's burgeoning black communities. And these reports suffered from dubious methodologies and racial bias, leading to the stigmatisation and further discrimination of these early black Britons. In her report, Sharp, an associate of the League of Coloured People, made some attempts to mitigate the damage done by similar surveys and attempted a more empathetic and balanced approach. And what can be seen from Sharp's maps is a dense concentration of black settlement focused in the area around Llafur Square. By 1934, according to Sharp's estimates, Cardiff's non-white population stood at around 3,000, over 2,000 of whom she believed to be of African descent from the Caribbean and West Africa. The foundation of this settlement and its development had its roots in a multifaceted role that the Siemens provided by the Seamen's boarding house. The earliest black seamen's boarding house uncovered in the area dates from 1871. Lying in the streets just north at 12 South Church Street, it provided accommodation principally for seamen from the Caribbean and some lodgers from the United States. The keeper of this boarding house was Emmanuel Fennis from Cape Verde, part then of Portuguese West Africa. And Cardiff was home to a substantial Portuguese West African presence, and several prominent black boarding house keepers hailed from the islands over the years. The Fennis family formed something of a boarding house dynasty in Cardiff. When Emmanuel passed away in 1900, his second wife, Sarah, born in Newport, took over the running of 12 South Church Street, which in turn passed to their son, Isaac. And Isaac is on record applying to renew his boarding house license in 1931, highlighting 60 years of business. Now, this longevity was particularly impressive, as running a seaman's boarding house was a notoriously precarious profession, with many keepers cutting their losses and abandoning their business after only a few years. And despite this precarity within the industry, the census data remains helpful in mapping the growth of seamen's boarding houses in Cardiff. In 1891, only 2 black seamen's boarding houses were operating in the area, and this grew to 5 10 years later. Like 12 South Church Street, these early houses provided lodgings for predominantly Caribbean seamen. However, by 1911, there was a substantial increase that saw the number of seamen's boarding houses grow to 17, 8 for Caribbean seamen, 2 for West African, and 7 mixed boarding houses. Mixed seamen's boarding houses remained segregated along ethnic lines and were defined as businesses that did not cater to a single group, but to a mixture of seamen of African origin or descent. Liverpool exhibited a similar sharp growth in black seamen's boarding houses in 1911, suggesting that the